Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. Now, as we approach the final days of August, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival 2023 has officially come to an end, and this year I visited Edinburgh at the beginning of the month and managed to see 30 different Fringe shows in about 5 days, which has already been very well documented in the 2 vlogs that I've uploaded here on my channel. If you want to see what happened when I went to the Edinburgh Fringe this year, what we saw, what we ate, how we ran madly around the city trying to make every show on time, you can go and check out those if you haven't already. But today I want to bring you the reviews of the shows that I saw while in Edinburgh. So if you're wondering where these reviews were appearing while I was at the Fringe, they were published on my Instagram and my TikTok, which is generally where I tend to post the shorter reviews that I make. So if you're curious about these shows and you want to see the full review I gave to each of them, you can go and head over to my Instagram page and check them out over there. But for those of you who do not have that platform and were wondering what I thought of the shows and what my highlights of this year's Edinburgh Fringe Festival were, I'm going to do a little bit of a roundup and I'm going to try and rank every single show that I saw this year at the Fringe and bring you a snippet of each of those reviews. Before I share my reviews, let me know if you saw any shows this year at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. What was the best show you saw? What was the worst show you saw? Comment down below because we're all very curious. So I am going to put them in an order from 1 to 30, but it's not the most exact science because a lot of these are wildly different genres of show. How do you rank a cabaret against an immersive experience, against a play, against a musical? Broadly, however, we are going to go from the lowest star ratings to the highest. So stay tuned to find out all of the highs and lows of my Edinburgh Fringe 2023. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to my Stagey YouTube channel. I will be back at the Fringe next year, and way in advance of that, I will be bringing you my recommendations for the 2024 shows. There will be more vlog content and there will be more reviews. In the meantime, I plan to be reviewing many more shows all around the UK, so make sure you're subscribed. Now, let's talk about the Edinburgh Fringe 2023. So nothing was so dreadful that it got a 1-star review. I think something has to be actively super offensive to get a 1-star review, but we are going to start at the 2-star section. 2-star for me means it actively wasn't enjoyable and it needs a lot of improvement. So in at number 30 was a musical called Sing River. And I'm sorry to say I struggled to connect with this piece on almost every level. What little I could discern of its plot left me almost entirely unmoved. So Sing River combines this admittedly atmospheric, ethereal folk score with the story of a young man, and as a character his intention is to relate to us the stories of the river and one particular extended narrative, the lyrics to which are so poetic and sort of purple prose and metaphorical that it's rendered quite inaccessible from a narrative perspective, amongst which there is a very true story about his life that is emerging sort of against his will. The more that we learn about his character through various snide, pretentious asides, the less likable he becomes. Like I mentioned, I really struggled to connect to this show as depicting really important themes. I just think they ought to have been handled with a little bit more clarity, the clarity that they deserved. And unfortunately, in a one-person show, there's really very little you can do to recover from an alienating protagonist. Next, at number 29, was a play called Buff. I find it a little bit frustrating that a play can spend so long talking about issues without ever really tackling them. And it concerns the character of Nick, who is a plus-sized gay primary school teacher, and he is very excited about the arrival of his new flatmate, who is a buff, conventionally attractive Instagram model. But there's so many important themes that we could be talking about with this play, talking about body image and how that ties in with internalized homophobia and the idea of shame. There's this frustrating habit of moving away from a situation just as soon as it's about to get dramatically interesting, that is until right at the end of the play. He uses gay terminology and sexual references that get a decent laugh. It's pretty low-hanging fruit, but at least we're laughing. This was another one for me, with a little bit of an alienating protagonist. I felt like it touched on a load of really important themes, but it didn't do anything with them. Structurally, it wasn't super interesting. This probably ranks as my biggest disappointment of the Fringe because I felt like it had so much potential that got squandered. Then at number 28 was another new musical called We'll Have None of It. This actor-musician show, which is based on real stories, follows 4 friends at a convent school in the 1960s. And it very lightly touches on a lot of interesting themes. We hear about Anglo-Irish relations, we briefly allude to sexuality, but I don't know if it's really been able to carve out an identity for itself yet. I say that because a lot of it feels tonally like it's trying to remain buoyant in the face of some understandably somber themes. But my principal issue is the lyrics. They sing almost exclusively in metaphor. So many of the things that it is depicting, so many of the events that unfold, are themselves the ingredients for really satisfying drama, but for some reason it just doesn't rise. I still think there is the chance for this show to go on to become something stronger. I think it merits a heavy rewrite, but there's something special within there somewhere. I just think the tone with which it's written doesn't really serve the material. At number 27 was Chriskirkpatrickmas. This is a musical that combines the plot of It's a Wonderful Life with a hilarious little smattering of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol with the boy band members of NSYNC. All of which is a really fun concept. It's at its best when it's closely parodying the source material it's based on. And for it to be as funny as that, and for it to be as funny as the material can be, I feel like the performances broadly need to be dialed up just a little bit. They felt a little bit tentative. It peaked with a number right in the middle that had very meta lyrics about being a boy band song, but the way that it was choreographed, the way that it was written, it parodied boy band material, and it made me think the rest of the score could be this as well. We had some more generic musical theatre songs around that, and I thought if they all sounded like boy band music, that would be really great. That's what this score ought to sound like. It's worth saying, I've seen so many glowing reviews and really positive word of mouth. I don't know whether the performances came together a little bit more as the Fringe progressed. For me, that was probably the biggest factor that was stopping me enjoying this. Because like I mentioned, the concept, so strong. I so badly wanted to love this. I just needed it to be more wild, more ludicrous, more exuberant, more characterized. So it's at this point that we jump from the 2-star reviews up to the 3-star reviews. And we have number 26, which was Tink. We meet a young girl who is expressing her disappointment at the character of Tinkerbell as depicted in Peter Pan. What we end up getting is a story that doesn't resemble Peter Pan in any way. It's not that it's a modern retelling of Tinkerbell's story, it's just a completely different character that reimagines Tink as a young female fairy whose enthusiasm and ambition and confidence is slowly depleted by the actions of those around her. The narrative here is actually very powerful, and the clarity of this narrative and the strength of this metaphor I think makes this show really applicable to a younger audience. It's a very sweet and wholesome story. I just don't know if the writing is sophisticated enough to really appeal to an adult audience. Now, despite having ranked this quite low on my list, I did find this to be really endearing, and I think, like I mentioned in that clip, the concept very strong. Like I said, possibly more applicable to a younger audience, and I think it does merit a little bit of clarification about how we get into the story and the fact that it's not about Tinkerbell ostensibly, but we're just using that as a lens through which to access this different story. Next at number 25 was Polko. This modern memory play from Angus Harrison was written during the first lockdown and was inspired by the idea of many young people having to return to their family homes. Joe, who still lives with his mum and works in a hotel, tries to comfort Emma about the realities of living with your parents as an adult. They talk about a lot of issues affecting young people, and from there we get some really interesting dialogue, but we never quite use that as a springboard in order to talk about the bigger problems that transcend these individuals. We talk about the circumstances under which Emma lost her job. We talk about the very particular circumstances in which Joe is living and his very specific worldview. There's a sort of a simmering tension between them that feels like it's going to bubble to a boiling point, but then never really does. I have very little overtly negative to say about this production. This is sort of the textbook example of an inoffensive play to me. It was performed well, it was staged well, there just wasn't much rise and fall. There was very little drama, it was just sort of consistently mild storytelling with one gasp moment right at the end. At number 24 was a musical called Jingle Street. And it follows the story of an ambitious, workaholic corporate jingle writer named Colin, who through largely unexplained circumstances becomes cursed with what we come to discover is jingle fever. This sort of Groundhog Day meets Mad Men chapter of the show in which he can only communicate by singing in jingles, and that gets him into a lot of different issues, is really short-lived. And I think the key issue is how the jingles themselves are performed. I want there to be more jingles, I want there to be sillier jingles, and I think they need to be accompanied. The problem is that he's trying to perform these jingles a cappella, and so it feels clumsy and awkward. I just wish it had a little bit more fun with its truly brilliant and naturally musical concept. So we're getting to the point of the list where it's things I actually did enjoy, but if you're going to be a sort of silly, light-hearted comedy musical at the Edinburgh Fringe, you need to be one of three things. Either ridiculously funny, secretly incredibly clever, or deceptively heartfelt and meaningful. And this show tried to do each of those three things but didn't get all the way to any of them. We had some clever lyrics, we had a very developed subplot. I just wanted more from what the show was actually meant to be about. I think that concept is so strong they owe it to themselves and to audiences to really deliver that. At number 23 was Adults. This is the world premiere of a new black comedy play by Kieran Hurley. Adults is set in a brothel. A brothel which is shared by two sex workers, one of whom is there to greet their latest client, who it turns out is her old school English teacher. And this is a naturally dramatic situation. There's tension, there's an offstage character being talked about prior to their entrance, except this play has a problem, which is as soon as this other character does arrive, the only thing that can happen next is for them to begin an intimate scenario, which doesn't quite happen, but it gets very close. And it just feels as though as soon as we resolve this tension of the character who is late to arrive to their appointment, we start scrambling for a reason to perpetuate the rest of the play. Ironically, we lack a climax. I spent so much of this play just being shocked at how different it was to Kieran Hurley's previous play, Mouthpiece. But even with that aside, I just don't think that this was fantastic. Conleth Hill was brilliant in his performance. I'm just enduringly none the wiser about what it was this play was trying to articulate, and I'm still salty about the needlessly protracted ending. At number 22, we have On Your Bike. And it tells the story of two riders working for a company called Eatsaroo. And with minimum wage salaries and next to no employee benefits, the only thing that keeps them going as they struggle to get by is the growing romance that is sparking between them. Just like Jingle Street, this is off the wall and bonkers and silly. I feel like the opportunities where the songs arise occur more naturally, more whimsically, and there's some particularly brilliant lyrics in this one as well. More than once I was bowled over by a really great turn of phrase. There's one particular number where he's plotting against the Mega Chicken Corporation. It's very old school musical theatre. There's a little bit of a rap moment as well, which is brilliant and hilarious and ridiculous. So we're still in 3-star territory here. This ranks a little above Jingle Street, but the two shows have similar problems in kind of halfway succeeding on a few fronts, but not being all the way hilarious or all the way touching. I actually think the concept of Jingle Street is more original, but the comedy and the material in this one are probably better written. At number 21 was another new musical called Godcatcher. This is certainly a show that is still developing, but I thought that the ideas and the themes that were woven into its material were excellent. This is a brand new musical that reimagines the backstory behind the Greek myth of Arachne. Because in Greek mythology, Arachne was a talented weaver who beat the vengeful goddess Athena in a weaving contest, and so naturally was turned into a spider. And it's an ingenious match of this story to the ideas that the writers want to convey with it. Women's stories being erased, this idea of what happens when you speak truth to power. Anything that starts to sound a little bit contemporary musical theatre is going to feel anachronistic with this ancient story. And the dialogue has aspects of that as well. I almost think that this might be more successful if it was just a completely sung-through musical. This was a really difficult rating for me because this felt more like a student show, and if I was to rank it on those terms, it probably would have had a 4-star rating because I think it has a tremendous amount of promise. I can see where it would be expanded. I'm excited about the concept. There's a huge amount of this I really love. It just has that slightly inescapable amateurish sheen, and so in the context of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, it's still a 3. At number 20 was Monét XChange. Monét XChange is an American drag queen. She is an alumnus of RuPaul's Drag Race. She is also a trained opera singer, and that is the pretense under which we meet her in this show. She walks onto a bare stage and she is about to sing, but as we hear the introduction play, she interrupts it to give us a little bit of context, and then increasingly to tell us different stories that will help our understanding of the song that she is about to perform. So many of these stories are about music or about a particular song. She recalls occasions where she sang something, performances that were hugely well received, performances that were not as well received, and we don't get to hear any of those songs until the end of the show. There is a part of me that wonders if it wouldn't be better if we heard each song in the instance when it's first recalled. Not only does this obviously put each performance into context, but it also gives us a sense of variety. Otherwise, we have this sort of very harsh contrast between the portion of the show that is just spent speaking and telling these stories that are admittedly very funny, very engaging stories, and then the singing that happens at the end. Now, I've seen enough drag shows in my time to know when a brilliant performer is kind of coasting on their charisma and their charm and the fact that fans are going to turn up and hang on every word that they're saying. I think Monét XChange is incredibly talented, very likeable, very funny, a brilliant storyteller, but I don't think this was a show that challenged her in any way or really effectively showcased the versatility of her talent. Number 19 on my list was another new musical called Four Felons and a Funeral.
It was a queer madcap road trip musical between a group of 4 people who end up stealing another friend's ashes, which they hope to pour into a vat of Guinness at the Guinness factory in Dublin. Maddie Maguire gave the standout performance of the show as Bex, but it's a fun show, it's a sweet show, it has some actually very sophisticated songwriting, which you don't hear in every single musical at the Fringe. I think there's room for this material to be tailored and workshopped a little bit, especially in some of the earlier book scenes, but the way they establish location, the way that they maintain a pace, all fantastic.
This was the first show I saw. It was a really interesting show. My favourite part of this was definitely the composition of the score. There were some really interesting songs in there. I wonder if the show's emotional impact is a little limited by the slightness of its scope. This felt very much just like a story about these 4 specific characters and their relationships to each other. It didn't really access the themes that would transcend those characters and connect to people in the audience. And as wonderful as it is to see queer stories depicted on stage, I need something bigger. Number 18 was the Grand Old Opera House Hotel.
We follow a young man named Aaron who is just beginning a new job working at a Scottish hotel that has been converted from an opera house that caught fire. Naturally, it's rumoured to be haunted by a bunch of opera singers, but this isn't actually Aaron's biggest problem, because the hotel management is also completely inept. The other staff that he is working alongside are similarly unhelpful and also ridiculous. And I think that the love story that it blossoms into is a very sweet one, but it also surprises me that we get this tunnel vision from a narrative perspective so early on in the play, when we started introducing all of these characters and all of these other attendants, most of whom we don't really meet again substantially for much of the rest of the play. There are antics, there are innuendos aplenty, and an awful lot of beautiful opera singing. I just can't help but thinking there was an even more riotous farce here if we used maybe a smaller pool of characters.
I had lofty expectations for this one because it was written by Isabel MacArthur of Pride and Prejudice, sort of, and if this had continued with the energy that it brought to the stage in the first 20 minutes, I think I would have been thrilled. But it takes a sharp left turn out of farce and turns into an unexpected rom-com. There is a very winning operatic sequence towards the end, but the pace and the tone kept changing wildly at various points. It was a little difficult to tell what it was you were looking at. Now it's at this point that we move from the 3-star reviews, which were fine with only a few problems, up to the 4-star reviews, which were very good, very enjoyable, with room to develop further. Firstly, at number 17, we have Larry Owens Live, Proof of Concept.
So this was American actor Larry Owens, known largely for musical theatre, known for his performance in the off-Broadway production of A Strange Loop, and he's making his Edinburgh Fringe debut with his solo show POC, Proof of Concept, which is both a clever pun and an apt title, because it is loosely all about the audition pack that he had to put together in order to submit himself for the popular late-night sketch show whose title is often abbreviated to a 3-letter acronym. But he performs original songs as well as doing little comedy characters and skits. He has great banter with the audience in between all of this. We come to find out that it's rooted in a lot more depth and a lot more humanity. A lot of which I actually wish we explored a little bit further, and it's both a criticism and a compliment when I say I just wanted there to be more material.
I think Larry is so talented. I was so excited to see his show, and I just wanted more in every sense of the word. Longer, deeper, bolder. That sounds like I'm talking about something else. I'm not. I just wanted there to be more of a journey and an arc and a structure to this show so that it could give us a greater emotional impact, and about 15 minutes more material. Number 16 was a play called Salty Irina. This is a play written by Eve Lee, and it documents the reactions of 2 young women as they react to a troubling increase in the murder of local immigrants. The 2 of them decide to infiltrate an upcoming far-right festival in order to try and identify the culprits. And this is where the pace and the tone of everything just starts to shift. Slightly earlier in the play, we had a wonderful scene where time seemed to stop almost entirely because one of the characters stumbled upon a pool of blood, and there was so much room for her to react to this. And when they come to actually infiltrate this festival, understandably, everything moves at a slightly more accelerated pace, and we don't quite have the time to depict the events as meaningfully. Additionally, although the whole thing is troublingly believable, some of the circumstances that they find themselves in, specifically towards the later scenes of the play, begin to feel a little bit contrived. I did enjoy this, and I struggled to put my finger on why it didn't fall higher up in the ranking. Ultimately, ultimately I think it felt to me like two very different halves of plays that didn't quite marry up. Number 15 was A Mountain For Elodie.
This is a new show from Benjamin Scheuer. It's sort of a follow-up to his acclaimed piece, The Lion. We find out about the circumstances under which he met his wife and they began a family together, all of which unearthed a lot of complicated feelings that he thought had been resolved. He's written the most incredible set of songs here. He is a brilliant singer-songwriter, first of all. He's a singularly exceptional musician. The way that he plays these instruments betrays an enormous passion that transcends ability. When he's just speaking, he tends to read from one of 3 scripts, and that sort of inhibits us having a consistent emotional connection.
Benjamin Scheuer is surely one of the most talented people that I saw at the Edinburgh Fringe. These songs were beautiful and heartbreaking and performed from the soul, but this is evidently very new, very early material. It's why he was still using a script for the spoken sections when I saw it, and I think with a little bit more theatricality to the staging and a little bit more familiarity with the material, this is going to become something very special.
If somehow you manage to break away from the transfixing performance by Declan Bennett, the next thing you notice is that the poetry of his writing is just magical. It's not a COVID story, but it's a story about how that time affected him, how he was isolated, and how that forced him to confront feelings from his past. It's all quite linear and straightforward as we begin, and then it becomes more and more unruly as he's contending with all of these different emotions from different times. We see a lot of snippets from his teenage years. It has what I'd describe as an almost brutal vulnerability. It's incredibly raw, it's messy, and it's the unmatched charisma of Declan Bennett as a performer that makes this such a fantastic watch. So we already know what a wonderful performer Declan Bennett is from his performances in Once and Jesus Christ Superstar and Moulin Rouge, but I had no idea what a profound and beautiful writer he was. Some of the lines in this are so meaningful, so terrific. Excitingly, this has already announced a few dates in the West End. It will be playing at the Lyric Theatre coming up in conjunction with Bloody Elle, another Edinburgh Fringe show that I loved last year, and I'm really excited that London audiences are going to get to enjoy this show as well. Next at number 13 was a play called Bangers. So we meet what are discernibly 2 very different characters. One, a woman in her 30s who is just leaving an unfulfilling relationship and carrying around a huge amount of emotional baggage, the significance of which we don't come to understand until much later in the play. The other is a young boy on the brink of manhood who is undergoing a multifaceted identity crisis. Music is incorporated into the blood of this show. It's how it is performed. We go between these spoken sections and these musical moments that are inspired by early noughties and contemporary R&B and garage. We have these like almost rap battle sequences, but it affords the show this completely unique voice. It's an inherently super theatrical means of storytelling. It makes so much sense, and it gives each character's voice such a wonderful clarity.
I really enjoyed this. I was surprised by quite how much I enjoyed this. This began as something I wasn't sure was necessarily going to be for me, and I was so won over by the brilliant way that they used music, by the fantastic performances. I love a writer who can establish a really specific and unique voice, and that's something this play absolutely had. Number 12 was Big Kid Kindergarten.
There comes a point during the Edinburgh Fringe, and in life, honestly, where I begin to feel so overwhelmed that I long for the opportunity to absolve myself completely of all adult responsibility, and along came the perfect show. There are a bunch of toys and craft materials all over the floor, there are cushions. Beyond the joy of playing with toys again and covering our hands in PVA glue just so we could peel it off afterwards, there was the opportunity to connect with strangers in a way that maybe we haven't done since we had the naivety and innocence of childhood. What looked on the face of it like a silly activity turned out to be a fantastic opportunity to shake off your insecurities, your adult worries and anxieties, and bask in the joy of a rejuvenated inner child.
I wrestled with this because how do you star rate an experience like this? But I was completely charmed by it. I had the best time. I'm not someone who is easily won over by immersive opportunities. I don't like interacting with people I don't know necessarily, and I was able to do that because I was so relaxed, I was so put at ease, because it's very clever how well this has been structured. The performer leading it is brilliant at what they're doing. It's a really fantastic concept, and though this was very likely out of their control, it's a shame that there are so many Edinburgh Fringe venues that look like classrooms and recreational spaces that have to get turned into theatres, and this ended up being in a space that looked more like a theatre that it tried to turn into a classroom. Number 11 was the new musical Public.
It's about 4 different characters, very different personalities, they come from very different places, and they all get trapped together for an hour in a public bathroom, which is very clever because the show is also an hour long, so we see this whole interaction playing out in real time. There's a bunch of different intersecting identities here, there's a bunch of different intersecting attitudes here, and that's where the interesting meat of this comes from. The songs are so dynamic, so modern, so crowd-pleasing, and really polished. This is a very well put together show. But as we progress, most of the characters are afforded these vulnerable and introspective and reflective songs, and those would have more impact and those would have more power if they weren't consecutive. It's like everyone starts taking turns to sing about their feelings, and the weight of each one that's such a well-written song and so beautifully performed, it doesn't really have its full impact because we've just had something heartbreaking. There's a skill in being able to alternate those serious moments with a little bit more levity.
This was a super crowd-pleasing show, maybe the most raucous curtain call response that I heard the entire time I was at the Edinburgh Fringe. It had some really great songs, incredibly talented performers, mind-blowing vocals. It's one of those concepts that's very at home at the Edinburgh Fringe, and I'm hopeful it can make the jump to a more conventional kind of a theatre space. Certainly I think it's very possible that this show has some kind of a future ahead of it beyond the Edinburgh Fringe. At number 10 was Hello Kitty Must Die.
This show describes itself as an Asian feminist cult musical comedy hit, and it's about the character of Fiona Yu. She's this willful character who is defiant of these Chinese cultural expectations of her that are coming from her parents and from previous generations. And motivated by this, she makes these bold, independent decisions that see her in the middle of a deadly situation. This will genuinely have you gripped and wondering what's about to happen next. And the songs are so fantastic. People Culture is the best song I've heard at the Fringe so far. It was terrific. And I have to give credit to every single one of these 5 performers. They were so cohesive as a group. Everyone gave fantastic performances, but this is absolutely the musical of the Fringe for me so far. So original, so fun, so exciting. I wish I could go and see it again.
I really loved this show, and selfishly, as much as I would love for this to come down to London so I can see it again, this really belongs off-Broadway. This would kill off-Broadway. The cast were terrific, multi-rolling as all of these different characters. It's edgy, it's subversive, it's fun, and this is probably the cast recording that I need the most badly. I desperately need to hear these songs again because I really liked them. Number 9 was the play Sean and Daro Flake It Till They Make It.
This was a lovely piece of new writing by Laurie Motherwell about 2 young men, Sean and Daro, who reconnect at Sean's mother's funeral, whereupon Daro, who considers himself to be blessed with a huge amount of business acumen, suggests that the 2 of them should invest in an ice cream van, which has recently become available. And this is a wonderful and incredibly unique premise. Not only does Karen Tennant's set feature this brilliant onstage ice cream van, we also have all of the ice cream van music that you would associate with that. But once the comic novelty of this setting melts away, there is an enormity of heart underneath. It's a really genuine and moving and sincere play, all about friendship, but everything is played in such a realistic and honest way. It doesn't feel hugely over the top theatrical, it just feels like 2 real lads embarking on a really touching story together.
This was completely charming. It was also light, which I appreciated. The characters and the carefulness and the thoughtfulness with which they were both written and performed was a huge victory of this play. But it's also that kind of a plucky, sincere story that can appeal to audiences of all ages. Number 8 was the returning musical Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder.
And it tells the story of Kathy and Stella, murder enthusiasts who have been BFFs since childhood and are now running an as of yet not successful podcast called Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast from Kathy's mum's garage in Hull. They are utterly charming, brilliantly funny, and more than a little bit codependent. So this is a wonderful new musical that combines all of the comedic charm of someone like Victoria Wood with the compelling rising fascination in true crime. And it's been great to see this show evolve. I still think there's a version of this show with a slightly more clever staging, because right now the show doesn't really have a strong visual identity. It is just its humour and its songs.
So this show definitely has a future life ahead of it. We already know that it's going on tour. I'm actually going to be seeing it again at the Bristol Old Vic, and I might do another review simply because there's going to be even more material. I think there's going to be a new set design, so a lot of the things that I've spoken about I think are already going to change. so I'm very excited about this. Bronte and Rebecca, so good. Jodie Jacobs, MVP performer. There's lots to love about this show, and as it rises, I think it's going to gain itself a great many fans. Buy the merch now, before it gets more expensive. So now we have just passed the top of the 4-star reviews, and the top 7 shows I saw at the Edinburgh Fringe lie ahead of us, and these were all 5-star reviews. I loved each and every one of these shows, and putting them in an order when they were such wildly different kinds of shows was very difficult, so they all get gold stars as far as I'm concerned. But in at number 7 was the Kaye Hole. This show starts at 10 to midnight, it runs through to 2 a.m, and it features Ruben Kaye, who is this wizard of live cabaret performance. He's nefarious, notorious, and always ready to call out important social injustices. I love him. I think he is just fantastic. His opening patter alone in these shows, it's so slickly put together. He will make you scream with rage and joy simultaneously as he denounces the capitalist structure of the Edinburgh Fringe while celebrating its artistry and queerness. But he is presenting several different performers. There was musical comedy, there was stand-up, there was didgeridoo, there was bagpipes. I go to the Kaye Hole every year. I think Ruben Kaye is a god among cabaret performers, just the way that he commands a stage, the way that he stirs a room into a frenzy, and the way that he uplifts all of the other talent in Edinburgh is so admirable and so wonderful. You get such a varied, wild, unexpected night at the Kaye Hole. I will always go back. At number 6 was the musical Potty the Plant. This is a dark comedy musical about Potty the Potted Plant, who lives on the desk of the potentially sinister Dr. Acula at Little Boo Boo's General Hospital. But the commitment to comedy in this is peerless, and the jokes are brought about with such beautiful stupidity. If you were to think about a British version of a lot of those Star Kid musicals, you wouldn't be too far off from Potty the Plant. The songs are terrific and charming and buoyant and sound like a parody of those sweet kind of Sesame Street tunes. The commitment to physical comedy, the commitment to ridiculous running gags that keep recurring, it's just excellent. It's exactly the kind of show that should return year after year after year and develop a cult following. So I mentioned earlier in this, if something is going to be a silly, light-hearted musical, it needs to either be like deceptively funny, have a secret sincerity, or just be so hilarious. And this was that third one. It was so funny. Joke after joke after joke, we have visual gags and puns and callbacks to earlier jokes and the most beautifully stupid stuff. I just loved it. In fact, if you need proof of how much I loved this show, I'm literally wearing a Potty the Plant t-shirt that I bought afterwards. Now, I'm not necessarily sure if there's a home for this right now in London, simply because there doesn't exist the kind of space for this kind of silly comedy musical, but it's definitely the kind of thing that will thrive in a fringe theatre environment, and I hope it becomes this huge popular cult hit. Number 5 was Anything That We Want It To Be. This is a solo show from multi-hyphenate theatre maker Adam Lenson, whose work I was familiar with as a director and as a dramaturg, but this is him as a writer and as a performer, telling the story of a very particular chapter of his own life. This is the most carefully and brilliantly put together one-person show I think I've ever seen. The composition of this thing is almost surgically precise. We jump all around the timeline of his own life and the years that preceded his own life, the masterstroke of which being that all of these scenes are introduced to us in the context of their proximity to this fateful day. As Adam is talking about struggling under the weight of all of the different versions of himself that could be created by all of the different choices that he hasn't made in his life, he layers his voice on top of himself repeatedly until we hear how oppressive it is to exist within that particular anxiety. This show was so profound. I was so struck by it within the first few sentences of the script. I spoke in some of my other reviews of one-person shows about a sort of rawness and a messiness that didn't really matter because of the performers' charm and their charisma, and this had no messiness whatsoever. It was so precise, so purposefully structured, so brilliantly staged. All of the tech elements that made up the staging, the order of this completely unruly script that was jumping around these different time periods. Not a moment was wasted. I completely understood what it was that Adam Lenson was trying to say, and it was articulated so meaningfully, so cleverly, and so well. At number 4 was Oscar at the Crown. This is a
semi-immersive late-night musical theatre event which has transferred from New York. How I can even explain this show to you, I do not know, because it's a fascinatingly wild concept. This post-apocalyptic queer explosion. It's set in a dystopian fascist future where a small tribe of outcasts from society are retelling the story of Oscar Wilde. A largely factual retelling distorted through a contemporary hyperqueer lens. It playfully nods at popular culture, talking about the OC and various Real Housewives franchises. It's riotous, it's rebellious, it's bizarre, and it has this modern disco dance score that is instantly infectiously fun. I think the song Julie is the song of the Edinburgh Fringe 2023. Six as a musical walked so that Oscar at the Crown could vogue.
This was just so much fun. This was the perfect show to end the Edinburgh Fringe on. Like I said, it was riotous, it was camp, it was euphoric, it was raucous. They've already recorded a concept album. I've been listening to it constantly. These are some great songs. They're super new. And Julie was absolutely the best song of the Edinburgh Fringe 2023 for me. The other thing that Oscar at the Crown does so well is delivers what people will want when they go and see a show. It gives you high energy dancing. It gives you this immersive element. You feel like you're at a party. The vocals are literally out of this world. It's great. At number 3 was No Love Songs.
Normally I'm critical about the lyrical shortcomings of pre-written songs that are put into musicals, but with this show the performers breathed so much life into it, I was completely convinced. This is a semi-autobiographical new musical conceived by Laura Wilde and Kyle Falconer, utilising the music from his second album, and it tells the heartbreaking story of a young couple who meet, have a child together, and then experience the fallout of postnatal depression. And it's written so beautifully, but acted so incredibly powerfully by John McLarnon and Dawn Seavright. Both of them give hugely heartfelt performances. This show will break your heart into 1,000 tiny pieces and then not so much stitch it back together again as help you grow a new one entirely.
This completely destroyed me. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. It was so well acted by Dawn Seavright and John McLarnon. They were incredible. The intimacy and the connection and the emotion with which they performed these songs is what made it so affecting and is what made the meaning of each lyric so clear, even though they weren't purpose written for these situations. Number 2 was After the Act, a Section 28 musical.
And what this is a piece of verbatim musical theatre, which means the script and the songs have all been written based on real testimonies and news clippings and interviews, because After the Act both documents and eulogises a very harrowing chapter of British LGBT history when Section 28 was introduced, a piece of homophobic legislation passed by a Conservative government in Thatcherite Britain intended to prohibit the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities. A show like this has all the honesty of a documentary but affords its narrative additional gravity via the use of music. It also reminds us of why this is such an important and topical piece of theatre, because what's currently happening to the trans community, who are being marginalised and scapegoated in the same way that the wider LGBT community were back then, unfortunately proves why looking back on those years is so important. Shows like this are so vital and so urgent, they almost make everything else feel obsolete.
This was just such a piece of art to me. After seeing a lot of fairly traditionally structured things, it reopened my eyes about what a musical can do and what it can be and what theatre can be and how expansive that can be. This was an incredibly meaningful collage of all of these different ideas that represent an entire community. It was the perfect way of depicting a whole community of people on stage by bringing passionate life to each of those voices. This felt current and prescient and topical and necessary and urgent and vital, more so than anything else. Which brings us to number 1, my absolute favourite show of the Edinburgh Fringe, and it was a play called Bacon.
It's a two-hander about two young men named Mark and Darren who are encountering each other in the cafe where Mark is working years after meeting each other for the first time. Because they first met in year 10 as two very different boys from very different backgrounds who were about to share a journey of self-discovery. There is a very carefully curated power dynamic throughout the play. This is represented on stage by an incredible set design piece from Natalie Johnson. It's a seesaw. In more peaceful moments, the two men can counterbalance and support each other. other, but when their relationship turns more volatile, they have the ability to upend each other and assert physical dominance. It's impossible to say who is giving the stronger performance out of the two. It's such a brilliant collaboration on stage. They have a palpable chemistry that flickers with romance and bubbles with dangerous tension. Truly the most affecting, hard-hitting, explosive thing you could see this year at the Edinburgh Fringe.
If you happen to catch me on Front Row on BBC Radio 4 the other day, I've already given this play a little bit of a plug, but this bowled me over completely. It was one of those instant standing ovation moments, an obvious 5-star from me, an incredible piece of writing, so well performed. Both of these actors just incredible. It was unsettling and uncomfortable. As we moved between their youth and the present day, it kept challenging you to change your perspective on these characters and this situation with these increasingly traumatic circumstances. And a lot of shows have those moments where you just feel you've been punched in the gut. This had several. It already has a little bit of a touring life beyond the Edinburgh Fringe. It has been earmarked to head to New York on the back of its Edinburgh Fringe success, and hopefully it eventually finds its way back to London, because this is one of those plays that deserves to win all of the awards. It's an incredible piece of writing, it's an incredible piece of theatre, and shows like that are why I keep going to the Edinburgh Fringe. I hope you have enjoyed my ranking of all 30 shows that I saw this year at the Edinburgh Fringe. I'm so excited to see which shows have a future life, which shows I might get to see again. Will one of these be the next 6, which I first saw in A Purple Inflatable Cow and is now taking over the world? Will one of these be the next Fleabag that's become this huge success? We will all have to stay tuned to find out. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching today's video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more of my upcoming reviews as well. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!